Hi there, I'm Machine Pun Kelly, aka MPK, and today I want to wrap up a six-part series reviewing the significant Supreme Court cases around the due process rights for immigrants, both documented. Denmore v. Kim, 2003, a significant U.S. Supreme Court case that addressed the constitutionality of mandatory detention of non-citizens with criminal convictions during deportation proceedings, while affirming their due process protections under the Fifth Amendment. Historical context. The late 1990s were marked by stringent immigration reforms following the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act, III, of 1996, which expanded mandatory detention for non-citizens with certain criminal convictions, including lawful permanent residents, LPRs, of the Immigration and Nationality Act, INA. Required detention without bail hearings for non-citizens deemed deportable due to crimes like aggravated felonies or crimes of moral turpitude. The II era aimed to streamline deportations and reduce releases of non-citizens with criminal records, reflecting public concerns about immigration and crime. However, this led to prolonged detentions during immigration proceedings, often lasting months or years due to backlogged immigration courts. Hyung-Joon Kim, an LPR since 1984, was convicted of first-degree burglary in 1996 and petty theft with priors in 1997, crimes classified as deportable offenses under ISA. In 1999, the INS detained him pending deportation proceedings, invoking Section 236C, which mandated detention without a bail hearing for non-citizens with certain criminal convictions. Kim filed a habeas corpus petition, arguing that mandatory detention without an individualized hearing violated his Fifth Amendment due process rights as an LPR with deep U.S. ties, family, business, and long-term residency. He sought a bail hearing to assess his flight risk and danger to the community. The U.S. District Court granted Kim's petition, ordering a bail hearing, and the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals affirmed, finding that mandatory detention of LPRs raised serious constitutional concerns. The government appealed to the Supreme Court. The period saw growing legal challenges to mandatory detention, building on cases like Zadvidas v. Davis, 2001, which limited indefinite detention post-removal. Advocates argued that mandatory detention without individualized hearings violated due process, especially for LPRs with strong community ties. Parties involved. Charles Denmore was the district director of the INS in San Francisco, representing the federal government's authority to detain non-citizens under IA. Hyung-Joon Kim was a South Korean national and LPR who immigrated to the U.S. at age 6, ordered detained without a bail hearing after criminal convictions, facing deportation proceedings. Legal issues. Did the mandatory detention of non-citizens with criminal convictions without individualized bail hearings violate the Fifth Amendment's Due Process Clause? To what extent do due process protections apply to LPRs and other non-citizens during deportation proceedings, given Congress's plenary power over immigration? The Supreme Court upheld the constitutionality of mandatory detention under INA Section 236C, ruling that the government could detain non-citizens with criminal convictions during deportation proceedings without individualized bail hearings, consistent with due process. The court reaffirmed that non-citizens, including LPRs, are entitled to Fifth Amendment due process protections as persons within U.S. jurisdiction. However, it held that mandatory detention was a permissible limitation on liberty, as it was temporary and served the legitimate purpose of ensuring deportation and protecting public safety. The court emphasized Congress's plenary power over immigration, allowing it to impose mandatory detention for non-citizens with criminal records. It distinguished Denmore from Zadvidas v. Davis, 2001, noting that Zadvidas addressed indefinite detention post-removal, while Denmore involved temporary detention during ongoing proceedings, typically lasting months. Data showed that 85% of detained non-citizens had removal proceedings completed within an average of 47 days, with one-third released in under a month, suggesting detention was not indefinite. The government's interest in preventing flight and protecting the community justified mandatory detention, especially given Kim's criminal history. Kim's status as an LPR did not grant him greater due process rights than other non-citizens in this context, as immigration law treats all deportable aliens similarly. Detention during removal proceedings is a constitutionally permissible part of that process. Congress may require that persons be detained for the brief period necessary for their removal proceedings. Justice Kennedy concurred, but emphasized that due process requires limits on detention duration, suggesting that unusually prolonged detention could raise constitutional issues. Justice Souter, joined by Stevens and Ginsburg, argued that mandatory detention without a bail hearing violated due process, especially for LPRs with significant U.S. ties. The dissent criticized the lack of individualized assessments and noted that detention could last years in backlogged cases. The court reversed the Ninth Circuit, upholding Kim's mandatory detention and Section 236C's constitutionality. Kim remained detained pending his deportation proceedings. Denmore v. Kim reaffirmed that non-citizens, including LPRs and undocumented immigrants, are entitled to due process under the Fifth Amendment, consistent with precedents like Yikwo v. Hopkins, 1886, Wong Wing v. United States, 1896, and Zadvitas v. Davis, 2001. However, it clarified that due process does not require individualized bail hearings in all cases. The case balanced individual rights with government interests, allowing temporary mandatory detention as a constitutional exercise of immigration authority. Limits on detention. While upholding mandatory detention, the court emphasized its temporary nature, distinguishing it from the indefinite detention struck down in Zadvitas. Justice Kennedy's concurrence suggested that prolonged detention could trigger due process challenges, setting the stage for later cases. The ruling endorsed a categorical approach to detention for criminal non-citizens, prioritizing administrative efficiency over individualized assessments. Congress's plenary power. The decision reinforced Congress's broad authority to regulate immigration, including imposing mandatory detention for specific categories of non-citizens, even those with long-term U.S. residency. Broader impact, immediate effects. The ruling upheld the INS's and later ICE's practice of mandatory detention for non-citizens with qualifying criminal convictions, affecting thousands annually. It reduced the availability of bail hearings, streamlining deportation proceedings, but increasing detention durations for some. Kim himself was detained and likely deported, though his case brought attention to the plight of LPRs facing removal for minor or dated convictions. Long-term influence. Denmore shaped immigration detention policy, legitimizing mandatory detention under IRA, but prompting challenges to its scope. Cases like Jennings v. Rodriguez, 2018, and Nielsen v. Priap, 2019, built on Denmore, refining the balance between detention and due process. The decision influenced debates over detention conditions and durations, with advocates citing Justice Kennedy's concurrence to argue for limits on prolonged detention. It impacted LPRs significantly, as many with minor convictions faced mandatory detention, spurring advocacy for immigration reform to protect long-term residents. Contemporary relevance. In 2025, Denmore remains a key precedent in immigration detention cases, particularly amid expanded deportation efforts. Recent legal challenges to mandatory detention, especially for non-citizens with U.S. citizen children, reference Denmore's limits. Limitations and critiques. Narrow scope. The ruling upheld mandatory detention only for the brief period of removal proceedings, leaving open challenges to prolonged detentions, as later addressed in cases like Jennings v. Rodriguez. Lack of individualization. Critics argue that mandatory detention ignores individual circumstances, e.g. Kim's long-term residency, violating due process principles emphasized in earlier cases like Yamataya. Modern challenges. Court backlogs in 2025 often extend detention beyond the brief period cited in Denmore, undermining the ruling's premise. Additionally, the decision's deference to Congress limits judicial oversight of detention practices. Conclusion. Denmore v. Kim, 2003, arose from the mandatory detention of Young Jun Kim, an LPR facing deportation for criminal convictions, without a bail hearing under IRIRA. The Supreme Court's 6-3 ruling upheld the constitutionality of temporary mandatory detention, affirming Congress's immigration authority while recognizing non-citizens' due process rights under the Fifth Amendment. The case balanced enforcement needs with constitutional limits, influencing detention policies but sparking ongoing debates over fairness and duration. Its legacy endures in immigration law, shaping the treatment of criminal non-citizens. Once again, I'm Machine Pun Kelly, aka MPK. Thanks for watching. If you want to watch the next chapter, remember to click like and subscribe, and bookmark the Supreme Court playlist to keep up with all the videos in this series.